Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
I'm delighted to be the host for this session, where we'll discuss a research project titled Stories of Immigrant Service in the Military of the Five Eyes, Insights and Opportunities for the Canadian Armed Forces. I am Lieutenant Colonel Drew Lanier, the U.S. Army War College Visiting Defense Fellow assigned to the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University. I'm a Senior Human Resources Officer in the U.S. Army. I've been in the Army for 21 years. Initially serving as a field artillery officer after graduating from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and then transferring to human resources in 2011. My most recent assignment was as the 369th Adjutant General Battalion Commander in South Carolina. The 369th AG Battalion is the sole training battalion for the U.S. Army for human resources and finance soldiers, non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, and commissioned officers. This topic is of great interest to me and near and dear to my heart because of my time as the 369th AG Battalion Commander, where I personally served alongside of many U.S. Army finance and human resources soldiers who were born outside of the U.S. but are proudly serving in the U.S. military. A little bit of history on why I'm here. Each year, the U.S. Army sends a senior military officer to Queen's University to serve as a visiting defense fellow, and this has occurred since 1983. This fellowship is one of 80 U.S. Army War College fellowships at 57 different host institutions. Each officer is assigned for approximately 11 months, and we're tasked with integrating into the university and community and researching a topic of strategic importance. Today, we're joined by Dr. Grace Scoppio, Professor Emerita of Defense Studies at the Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University Fellow in CIDP. Grace has over 25 years of experience conducting interdisciplinary research on issues related to defense, with a focus on military personnel, including diversity and gender in military organizations, indigenous participation in the military, immigrants in the armed forces, military education, organizational culture, and lessons learned. Grace, thank you for being here today and for your time and interest in this topic.
Thank you very much, Drew, for this introduction, and thanks to the CIDP for the opportunity to share our research. As we're at Queen's University in Kingston, I would like to just start by acknowledging that Queen's is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and we're all very grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands.
Thank you, Grace, for this important land acknowledgement. Grace, what was your inspiration to pursue this research project?
So, Drew, the inspiration for this project came from a prior study on immigrant participation in the armed forces of 12 different countries, which I started in 2020. At that time, my collaborator for that study was Sarah Greco. The study was supported by the CIDP at Queen's and resulted in several outputs, including a workshop, a policy brief, and a book titled The Power of Diversity in the Armed Forces, published in 2022 by McGill Queen's University Press. That study identified different approaches towards the inclusion or exclusion of immigrants, non-citizens, in the militaries of those 12 different countries. And throughout the study, it also came to light that not only there's not a lot of research on immigrants in the armed forces from an international and comparative perspective, but what is particularly absent are the voices of immigrant service members themselves. And so to kind of fill this gap in research, we embarked on a qualitative study to explore different immigration and military service experiences using narrative inquiry to basically elicit the stories of these immigrant soldiers, aviators, and sailors serving in the militaries of the Five Eyes countries, as you know, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
Thanks, Grace. Can you also tell us a little bit about the research team?
So my collaborator for this research is Amy Vieira, whom I met in 2021, while I was very fortunate to be awarded a Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Peace and War Studies, and I was hosted at Norwich University in Vermont in the U.S., where Amy was, at the time, a professor of sociology. Amy has extensive experience conducting qualitative interviews with minority populations, such as immigrants, military service members, conflict interpreters in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also cross-cultural competence in U.S. military members. So her past experience in qualitative interviewing, and specifically non-native English speakers, made her a real asset in our data collection activities and in the project overall. So Amy and I have been working very well together on this study since the start, with the support of 4 different research assistants. So I'll just say a few words about them. Our current research assistant for the study, Sawyer Hagenkamp, he's a PhD student in social welfare at University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and he's currently focusing on violence and safety in schools and community context. He's a graduate of Harvard University as well as Queen's University, and actually that's where we met a few years ago when he was one of the research assistants for previous studies that I conducted in collaboration with Nancy Otis. And the study regarded the regular officer training plan using gender-based analysis plus, and we examined the experiences of officer cadets in the Canadian military colleges through an intersectional lens. Our previous research assistants were Alex Olteanu, followed by David Baidu-Anu and Jaguo, who were all graduate students right here at Queen's at that time. As a last point about the research team, I'm just going to say there's an interesting link between the research team and the topic of the study of immigration. Both myself and Amy are immigrants to Canada. She's an American. I was born in Italy. And this has facilitated our understanding of our participants' migration experience. And our 3 previous RAs, so Alex, David, and Ja, were also immigrants to Canada. And our current RA, Sawyer, is a Canadian studying in the U.S., so he also has the experience of living in a new country. So it's just kind of interesting. Everybody on the research team is an immigrant.
Right, thanks, Grace. I was also wondering if you could give us a brief overview of the research project and the timeline of the study from start to finish.
Sure. So I'll just start with a brief overview of the study. So starting with the goal of our research, we aim to collect personal stories of immigrant soldiers. And I say soldiers, but I'm also including everybody. So it's just a general term to better understand the varieties of experiences and the motivations for military service by immigrants. And so to achieve this goal, we conducted interviews with immigrants who are currently in military service or recently separated from service for a country other than their birth country. So in total, we gathered 57 interviews, of which 22 with immigrants, or foreign-born, if we want to say, serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, 11 in the U.S. Armed Forces, 10 in the Australian Defence Force, 5 in the New Zealand Defence Force, and 5 in the UK military. We conducted the interviews mostly virtually. We used Microsoft Teams as a platform to record as well as automatically transcribe the interviews. A few of the interviews were in person with participants that were serving in the Canadian Armed Forces that were located in proximity of Kingston, which is where I live and where we have a Canadian Forces base. So when we started, we had no predetermined research questions or hypothesis. We used sort of a narrative interviewing approach as a method to allow the participants to tell their own stories. And so it was more like a communicative process. So our role as interviewers was mostly to listen to and learn from our participants, like basically our storytellers. So because of these are machine-generated transcriptions, we had to verify them. So both Amy and I verified each of them for quality assurance and accuracy. Then to do the analysis, we use a software called MaxQDA for the qualitative data analysis to code the transcription based on emerging themes. Of course, all respondents are kept anonymous for reporting purposes. And as a last point, you asked in terms of our timeline. So we began our research when I was in the States in spring of 2021, and we completed the data gathering in fall of 2024, and here we are.
Your team was working on this globally dispersed way on a project that required getting access to and buy-in from populations that are not necessarily easy to identify nor to convince to participate in a research study. How did you manage to get so many participants, and how difficult were the technical aspects of conducting these interviews?
So when we started the study, we relied on our own networks just to identify the initial participants. So Amy had an initial contact, and that initial contact gave us 3 of our original respondents. I knew a few members serving the Canadian Armed Forces and the Australian Defence Force. And also one of our research assistants knew an immigrant soldier serving in the U.S. Army. So with these initial contacts were military members who either met the criteria for the study to participate in our study and or they knew someone who did. So in terms of challenges, initially we didn't realize at first how challenging this would be. It turned out to be much more difficult. And so most of our respondents were recruited via what we call a trusted contact. And boy, do we ever work our contacts and our networks, including our very own CIDP visiting defense fellows from the Canadian and the U.S. military, such as yourself. So we're very grateful. In particular, what was the most difficult was to identify participants in the militaries of the other 2 countries of the Five Eyes, namely the United Kingdom and New Zealand, because we didn't have as many initial leads. So basically, Drew, we complemented our network contacts by using the snowball sampling technique to identify additional participants. Just to clarify for our listener, the snowball sampling is a non-probability sampling technique. So where you use your existing participants to recruit future participants from their own network. And this was really useful because this is a hard-to-reach population. So we're looking for individuals with specific characteristics. We're looking for immigrants, namely, aka foreign-born, who were serving or recently served in the military of one of the Five Eyes countries and who were not born in that country. So basically, these referrals created what is called a snowball effect. So our sample size kept growing as we recruited more participants. In terms of the technology, we had to be adaptable and really double review the artificial intelligence generated transcripts because they struggle to transcribe many of the accents, right? So we're talking with people who are serving in 5 different countries who are coming from any part of the world that you can think of. So there was a lot of accents. So that's all about that, I think.
Okay, great. That's a fascinating approach. I appreciate that detail. So what were some of the highlights and also the challenges you and the team experienced as you conducted this study?
I would say the fact that we had the opportunity to listen to these amazing stories of almost 60 immigrant soldiers, aviators, and sailors born in 29 different countries was definitely a highlight. They shared stories of struggles, resilience, but also of successes and achievements. And it was just amazing just to listen to these stories. Some people came from war-torn countries, and some of those stories, as you can imagine, were heartbreaking. So in terms of challenges, one of the challenges was to identify participants who were women. And this is mostly due to the fact that women are overall underrepresented in the armed forces. For example, if we look at the Canadian Forces, for example, give or take, the current percentage of women serving in the CAF is about 16.5%. So 16.5%. But again, thanks to our own networks and the snowball effect, we were able to identify and interview 8 women who met the criteria for our study. So we were very happy with that.
Okay, awesome. Next, I'd like to know what you did, or what did you find most surprising to include? What did you not expect that came to fruition as you started hearing these stories?
I would say people really appreciated getting the chance to tell their stories to a pair of, interested, non-judgmental listeners. In a few cases, they acknowledged that they told us things they'd never told anyone else. And that was just really humbling. Again, as I mentioned, sometimes we heard stories that brought us to tears, especially those participants who overcame incredibly difficult circumstances in their country of origin, war-torn countries, stories of struggles. It was just incredible. Another thing that was interesting and surprising as we were conducting the study is that our sample includes a significant number of participants who had prior military experience in their birth country. I think it was 29 in total. And then they transferred to the military of their new country of immigration. So we refer to these participants as lateral transfer soldiers. So we thought that was really interesting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So on that same note, what were some of the key differences and similarities across the militaries of the Five Eyes, and what were the overall takeaways?
Okay, so the Australian Defence Force has a clear pathways and a recruiting process for lateral transfer soldiers, and they also assist these new members in the immigration process. We found that this is not the case for Canada. New Zealand had a pathway for lateral transfer soldiers, but their lateral transfer recruiting is currently closed, and it's right on their website. Another point, while Canada only recently opened military recruiting to permanent residents of Canada in the fall of 2022, other countries have a much longer history of recruiting immigrants who are not yet citizens, as you know, such as the U.S. While in the United Kingdom, for example, they allow any citizen of the Commonwealth to serve in the military. And again, it's been like that for decades. In terms of similarities, still focusing on lateral transfers, going back to lateral transfer, usually the new military offers no orientation training for these lateral transfer soldiers. And they also, they experience a rank reduction as they join the military in the new country. So we thought that was interesting because that was true pretty much across the board. Also, sometimes they had difficulty in getting promoted, and they also felt that their extensive prior training and experience, which was basically the reason why they got recruited in the first place, were not really fully utilized in the military of the new country. So sometimes, people would say to them, well, that's not how we do things around here, that type of discourse, right? So we felt that was kind of interesting. Another common thread was the difficulty in obtaining security clearance by many of the immigrant soldiers that we interviewed, regardless if they were lateral transfers or new immigrants to the country, right? So what else? Some immigrants sometimes were questioned about their loyalty, or they experienced prejudice, racism, or gender discrimination, whether they were serving in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or the UK. We heard different stories, however, from the immigrant soldiers serving in the U.S. military. They felt that there were very strong policies in place, and zero tolerance by the leadership towards any instances of racism and discrimination at all. However, that said, some participants expressed sort of how difficult life in the community as an immigrant could be, complicated by language, cultural considerations, and that includes in the U.S. So life as an immigrant, the struggles were kind of similar across the board of the Five Eyes. Maybe as a last point, the experiences and the responses from the UK and the US respondents were a bit different from the Canadian Forces, Australian Defence Force, and New Zealand Defence Force. Our eyes were really opened by these members who had a career with their native military and then immigrated to serve in another military. So that's pretty much all the points I can think of right now, Drew.
Okay, great. Well, that feedback, specifically as you're talking about those who joined the U.S. military, kind of makes me want to ask, from the U.S. perspective, the term American Dream is known globally, but what did your research reveal about this concept?
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea that we can talk about for a minute. So the immigrant soldiers serving in the U.S. military that we interviewed felt, by and large, that their military service helped them to build their American identity, facilitated their assimilation by improving their language skills, helped them feel acculturated in the American value system, in the community, and ultimately they felt they really belong in America. Some participants really refer specifically to the American dream that you just mentioned. So I did write down a couple of quotes. I just wanted to share them with you. So, for example, one participant who was born in Iraq said, and I quote, "Because this is the land of opportunity," referring to America, "this is the land of dreams. If you have a dream, it comes true. If you really, truly work for it, the United States, this is my opinion, and it's not just a personal opinion, it's the truth, is the best country out there." Another quote that I just, noted down is that from a participant born in Nigeria, who referred to the American dream as he described his family's decision to leave Nigeria. And I quote again, "It was a tough decision for my dad because he was at the peak of his career as a civil engineer. However, that's the start of my American dream," unquote. Very powerful, very powerful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Those are very inspirational perspectives. I appreciate you sharing those. You mentioned that respondents from the U.S. military generally express positive integration for their diverse backgrounds by leadership, although with some challenges related to completing their transition to citizenship. Did the research team glean any insights as to why the U.S. military seemed to be effective or more effective at positively integrating immigrants?
I'll share a couple of points. So I mentioned already, one of the main reasons is that the U.S. has a very long history of foreign-born non-citizens serving in their military, and they proactively recruit immigrants through different pathways. So another point is that we found that overall, immigrant soldiers serving in the U.S. military that we talked to felt that the immigration process was not super difficult. They had a very positive experience in the military. They were grateful for the opportunities offered by the military. So these are a couple of points that come to mind.
So then shifting to a Canadian perspective, how could the Canadian government and the Canadian Armed Forces learn from, and what could they implement based on your research?
They should provide clear policies and support for lateral transfer immigrant soldiers, including an orientation training to help their transition in the Canadian Armed Forces, and also support to build their new lives in Canada with their families. So family was a big theme also in our research, right? So immigration is really a family affair. Another point, attraction to recruit members serving in other militaries seems to be by word of mouth in the Canadian Forces versus other countries that have more specific pathways. So I mentioned the Australian Defence Force for sure is a good model. New Zealand Defence Force, however, as mentioned, they've suspended the program. So that's not there on their website anymore. Another point, we feel there should be more targeted recruiting towards attracting immigrants, non-citizens who to join the Canadian military. So, for example, the United States have very different approach. They have more clear pathways for immigrants, non-citizens to be recruited. They offer expedited citizenship. Now, we should mention Canada is improving recruiting since we started the study in 2021. And as mentioned in 2022, they opened recruiting to permanent residents. So these are excellent first steps for sure. Another point, we heard about issues around gender, including sexual harassment, race and religion. We identified that the U.S. military has zero tolerance against anyone saying anything that it was in any way discriminatory. And our U.S. respondents felt that they had the power to speak up, and they have strong policies in place to back them up. That's not to say that Canada and the other countries don't have those policies in place, but ultimately, we feel it's an issue of organizational culture that starts from basic training, right at the start. There should be zero tolerance for anything of this nature. As another point, maybe my last point, so considering that in the Canadian population, there's a very high percentage of foreign-born, Canada should really capitalize on this as they rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces, because we are short, as you know, several thousand positions, and the number varies, but ranging from 16 to 17,000 on for a force that is only around 100,000. So that's almost 15%, right? So so to give you an idea in terms of our immigrant population, there's probably a quarter of the population in Canada who either are or were a landed immigrant or a permanent resident of Canada. So this proportion keeps growing, and it's the highest or one of the highest among the G7. So Canada, the Canadian Forces really need to capitalize of a quarter of the population of Canada, basically.
Okay, awesome. Those are really good recommendations and data points. How have you and the research team disseminated the results of your research?
Well, I think we've done a fairly good job. So since we started the study in 2021, we've disseminated results through various national, international venues, presentations, publications co-authored with our research assistants. So we published an article in the peer-reviewed Journal of Military and Strategic Studies. We delivered 6 presentations at different conferences in Canada and the United States, including in particular a few at the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society, or IUS, which is held biannually in the US and on opposite years in Canada. And then, we also delivered a public talk through the CIDP as part of the International and Defense Policy Speaker Series, and we did that in September 2024. So again, we're very grateful for all the support we're receiving from the CIDP.
Okay, great. So that now that the data collection phase and the initial analysis of the study are completed, what's your way ahead?
Sure. So as a next step, what we are working on with Amy and Sawyer is a policy brief for the CIDP. So we are hoping to wrap that up in the next few weeks. In the longer term, Amy and I have a dream. We would love to publish a monograph to really comprehensively capture the voices of all our 57 participants, share the findings from all of the interviews, and, try to draw some of those cross-country comparisons, lessons, and best practices across all of the Five Eyes militaries. And so ultimately, we hope that all the professional communications, the publications will help inform policy and practices, ultimately to better support immigrants serving in the military.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Grace. So earlier in the podcast, you spoke about your sources and how you're connected. So I just kind of wanted to add a little bit onto it. So because of my previous position, it was an absolute honor to connect Grace and her team with a few soldiers from my previous unit. And that were, some of the soldiers that were interviewed. They were just absolutely phenomenal. I saw those in 2 years of battalion command. And so this is just kind of my perspective and given my own experience working with the immigrant soldiers. These soldiers that I specifically worked with, and I assume it's the same across the board with the 57 participants she had, these soldiers were committed and loyal, and unequivocally they were assets to the U.S. Army, without a doubt. You could tell a lot of them did have the language barriers and things like that. One of the things that we also benefited from in the U.S. Army that particularly catered to some of these immigrants were the Future Soldier Prep program. So one soldier in particular I remember talking to right before he graduated, and he started telling me a little bit of his story. And he said he was working 3 jobs. He had a couple kids. He was married. I think he was in New York State. And he said he found out about the Future Soldier Prep program, went and talked to a recruiter. And he was actually able to go to the Future Soldier Prep program, and he spent numerous weeks prior to basic training learning and improving his English. And that's something he admitted he could not do while working 3 jobs because he was just too busy. But the U.S. Army in this program gave him time where he could get a paycheck, he could take care of his family, he could improve, and then it set him on a path to go to basic training. And then ultimately, he graduated as, I believe he was a finance soldier. But like I said, many of the foreign-born soldiers I served with were very educated. Some had master's degrees. Many, were fathers or mothers, brothers, sisters. Not necessarily a typical characteristic of the straight out of high school single recruit that most people expect in basic training, or those younger people in the military. But these soldiers, so many of them were very mature, driven. And in some cases, they were sending money back home to support their families in their home countries while they were training. So when Grace mentions the American dream, these soldiers are what I picture. And, to say they're inspiring is an understatement. But just my perspective. And again, it was an honor to be part of this podcast today with Grace, talking through, these concepts, and then, ultimately connecting her with a few more U.S. Army soldiers. But I can't thank you enough, Grace, for sharing some insights on this important research and just what you're doing for the militaries of the Five Eyes with these data points and recommendations.
Thank you, Drew. It was a pleasure to talk to you and share some of our insights from our project. Thanks again.
Absolutely.